All right, everybody, in the interest of time, let's start our session. My name is Henry Gao. I'm a law professor at Singapore Management University, and I'm very honored to chair this session where the Forum for East Asia, Latin America Cooperation, or FEALAC, will discuss the digital trade regulatory landscape. We will have 3 presentations. With the first one by Ms. Witada from ESCAP, our local host here, and the second one by Mr. Johan Mulder, who's from ECLAC, and the last one will be by Ms. Martina Ferrican, who will join us online. And after that, we will have Mr. Fandi Ahmed from Oxford as the discussant. So without further ado, may I turn the table to Ms. Witada, please.
Thank you very much, Henry, and welcome back, everyone. This is the second session already, and yesterday we have shown you very briefly about the Asia-Pacific landscape, and today we have a little bit more time to provide further insights. First of all, if you haven't seen the report, it's already available for download online, and the team will post the link again in Zoom chat, so you can access from there. Next slide, please. In these presentations, I'm going to focus on Asia Pacific that are members of FEALAC Forum. FEALAC is the Forum for East Asia and Latin America. In Asia, we have 16 Asia Pacific countries that are FEALAC members, but in this initiative, we managed to cover 13 pilot countries because the initiative on our Regional Digital Trade Integration Index is the first pilot phase, and we plan to continue expand it further. With the data that we have so far, we will be able to identify the level of Regional Digital Trade Integration Index that compare with between Asia Pacific that are part of FEALAC and Asia Pacific that are outside the group. As you can see, when we look at Regional Digital Integration Index score, FEALAC group, which is East Asia plus those in the Pacific, have lower Regional Digital Index score. What it means? It means it's likely that compliance costs of country in the FEALAC group will be lower than country outside the FEALAC group. And it is important to see how policy distance between these countries. And good news also for FEALAC group in Asia is that on the surface, we can detect a higher level of policy similarity in terms of digital trade related policies. Next slide, please. This graph you have already seen yesterday, but yesterday we show you whole Asia Pacific policy mapping. This is extract for FEALAC groups, and when it is focused on FEALAC country, good news for the groups is that the level of similarities get significantly higher than what we detect yesterday for whole Asia Pacific. But in terms of what areas that the region is close to each other, is still quite the same, that Asia Pacific are pretty much aligned together in terms of trade policies more than domestic regulations that go broader, as well as the policies on digital domains. Next slide, please. Then let's look a little bit more on diversity within the groups. So countries that you see in this list in the graph are the FEALAC country in Asia Pacific that we cover in this pilot phase. The range of compliance level in digital trade policy, compliance cost level in digital trade policy as represented by the index is vary quite widely between 0.1, which is New Zealand, to 0.57, which is Vietnam. Again, we can detect that trade policies generally is already low. However, you can notice Cambodia, Russia, Vietnam. These three pilot countries is still relatively high, even on the traditional measures. Compliance cost is still in the relatively high level. Come to digital governance. Good news for Asia Pacific FEALAC when compared to non-FEALAC, because for digital governance policy, the index show that FEALAC groups have significantly lower than non-FEALAC group for Asia Pacific. But on domestic regulations, both group FEALAC or non-FEALAC is still equally high in terms of compliance cost. Next slide, please. This slide is showing you how policy similarities by Asia Pacific countries with the other Asia Pacific. So each dot represent partners of country that represent on the name represent on the x-axis. For example, if you see Japan, the country that they are most similar overall in terms of digital trade related policy would be Australia, and the country that they are least similar is Vietnam. On average, we found that across these pilot countries, Japan and Malaysia get the highest level of overall policy similarities. When we go more specific to selected areas of policies, let's then look at data policies and e-commerce. So these are pillar 6, 7, and 12 if you go by the report, RDTII report. 4 countries come up as highest similarities within the groups of Asia Pacific FEALAC, that are Japan, Singapore, Australia, Malaysia. So the name of the countries is quite familiar in a sense that this country consider very active in take part of regional initiative such as CPTPP or DEPA. Next slide, please. Then this slide gives you a little bit deeper insight. We go by traditional trade policy measures. In this cluster, we look at tariff, non-tariff, and standard and procedures. So that's related to technical standards and also trade procedures. As you can see, tariff is almost no issue except in Cambodia. But for non-technical tariff measures, for example, import license, import bans, those quantitative restrictions is still important almost in all except some advanced. And standard procedures, which also significant almost across the groups as well. So common issues in this area emerge that the majority in the group still have issues with putting heavy conditional imports when it's come to digital device, and they are not accepting third-party certifications and that affect the delays and cost of complying to standards. Next slide, please. The second cluster is domestic regulation. In this cluster, we have public procurement, foreign direct investment, intellectual property rights, and telecom regulations. Common issues that we found in the majority of the sample size is high, strong condition on commercial presence requirement, foreign equity cap. Some countries also have joint venture requirements in sensitive sectors, in telecom sectors, in digital related sectors. In particular, the telecom sector is almost a common that they have state-owned enterprise issues. They have licensing requirements that strict. Fandy will talk about this in more detail. And most of the region, I mean, in the group, not participating in the WTO GPA, that make it even looser to have an international standard to be the guideline. Patent filing and copyright enforcement also appear as one of the factors across the group as well. Next slide. Next, yeah. This is digital governance policies, and this cover cross-border data policies, domestic data protection, intermediary liabilities, content access, and online sales transactions. The online sales and transaction is very much linked to e-commerce. Common issues that we found is demanding conditions as on the data flows. Most of the regions not participate in trade in digital agreements with binding commitments. Many countries put data retention measures. Some go very long period. Some cases have permanent retention period. And there are several countries that government can access to personal data without having to got permission. Limited safe harbors is common, very common in this region. Block and filtering is also very common. Also worrying about not participating in important UN convention or model laws. For example, e-contract or online signatures are absent in many parts of the group. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it. Is the very brief highlights. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Witada, for that really interesting presentation, which look at the situation here in Asia. Now let's turn to Mr. Johan Mulder. I understand that he recorded a presentation, so please show that, please.
Dear Mr. Chair, Henry Gao, and members of this very distinguished panel, Witada, Martina, and Fandi, I would have liked to participate live in this session, but as it is now 3 a.m. in the morning in Santiago, Chile, I prepared this recording. I thank ESCAP and Witada in particular for co-organizing this workshop with ECLAC. A special thanks to the FEALAC member countries for their financial support for this work. Since 2021, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean has collected, compiled, and analyzed data on the regulatory environment for digital trade in Latin America and the Caribbean. Until December, 20 out of 33 countries were covered in the analysis in 2 phases. And currently we are extending the sample, adding another 8 countries. This presentation provides some details of the regulatory landscape for digital trade in 20 countries of Latin America, and 18 out of these 20 are FEALAC member countries. ECLAC work in this area has been carried out by a team of 11 junior researchers supervised mainly by Martina Ferracane, to whom I am very grateful. LAC country scores, as you can see in this particular slide, show a large heterogeneity regarding their digital trade integration. Scores range from 0.12 in the case of Panama, the lowest scores, to 0.60 in the case of Cuba, the highest scores. Among the countries studied, 13 have an RDTII score below the overall average of LAC, reflecting the fact that few countries are driving the average, particularly Cuba and Venezuela. As can be seen from the figures, the South America countries in general restrict less digital trade, or in the contrast, they restrict somewhat more digital trade compared to countries in Central America in the middle and countries in the Caribbean. And here Cuba is the exception in the Caribbean context. Now, when we look at the digital policy spectrum for Latin America, we see that some areas stand out with regards to a high number of restrictions. So we see that individual RDTI pillar scores that require specific attention for analysis are a few, and we see that in this particular graph, the countries that have a score above 0.5 on specific pillars. And here, the pillars that stand out are internet intermediate reliability, telecom regulations and competition, and finally, foreign direct investment. And in the rest of the presentation, I would like to share some details on these particular 3 pillars where digital regulations seem to restrict most digital trade. So first, with regards to internet intermediate reliability scores in Latin America and the Caribbean, we see that the average score is relatively high, 0.49, being the highest across all peers. Brazil in this context is the only open country in Latin America and the Caribbean with a score of 0, whereas Cuba, Honduras and Venezuela are fully closed with a score of 1. And only 5 countries, Brazil, Jamaica, Panama, Paraguay and Trinidad and Tobago, provide a safe harbor for copyright infringements and other user activities. In addition, Chile, Costa Rica and Mexico provide a safe harbor limited to copyright infringements. And all other countries have not implemented any regime to limit the liability of intermediaries. 12 countries in the context of Latin America apply user identity requirements to purchase a SIM card for internet access. And also 4 countries, Cuba, Honduras, Paraguay and Venezuela, use monitoring requirements for internet intermediaries. Now moving to the second pillar where we see a relatively large number of restrictions is telecom regulations and competitions in the context of Latin America. And here we see that the average score of this pillar is 0.48, reflecting significant restrictions. And here Cuba has the highest score, while most countries do not restrict foreign direct investment in the telecom sector. However, 7 nations do impose certain types of FDI restrictions. In addition, the government owns share in the telecom sector in 12 countries in the region. Passive infrastructure sharing is practiced or mandated in all the countries, where only 6 countries implement functional and accounting separations for operators with significant market power, which is, by the way, considered a good practice to enhance competition. Among 14 remaining countries, 9 implement only accounting separation for operators with significant market power. In addition, countries have regulatory authority for the telecom sector, but the authority is reported of not being fully independent in 5 countries, being Brazil, Chile, Cuba, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Licensing requirements are associated with discriminatory conditions in 15 countries, requiring, in most cases, commercial or local presence of the telecom companies, but minimum capital requirements or non-transparent processes. Finally, half of the countries have fully appended the telecom reference paper to the schedule of commitments under the WTO General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade in Services, the GATS Agreement of 1994. And finally, an area I would like to just hold on 1 second. Is an area that the slide was skipped, so I will come now to my conclusions, saying that Latin America has a relatively open environment to digital trade, but we see that in 3 areas in particular, there are some concerns that restrictions in these areas may have a restrictive impact on digital trade. And in this context, most sub-regional integration schemes in Latin America and the Caribbean have digital agendas to promote an integrated digital market. However, it should be noticed that few of these sub-regional integration schemes actually have agreed upon concrete commitments to harmonize digital regulations. In this context, it's very important to stress the fact that the ECLAC, our Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, is promoting a collaboration agenda among all the governments in the region, also called ELAC, which tries to bring together the governments to agree on issues related to the digital economy and digital trade. And the 2022-2024 digital agenda for Latin America and the Caribbean has emerged as a key instrument for coordinating actions, including in the area of digital trade regulation. And to prepare this very important work of ECLAC to help governments in agreeing on common rules for digital trade, this FEALAC project is very important to as a step forward to identifying the heterogeneity in digital regulations in Latin America and the Caribbean, and mapping opportunities to promote convergence in trade rules, both within the sub-regional integration schemes and also among these integration schemes. Again, thank you very much, and I wish you a very exciting and promising rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks to Mr. Johan Muda for his really nice presentation. And thanks also to Watada for presenting the FEALAC situation analysis. Next, we are going to have a comparative analysis between Asia Pacific and FEALAC countries from Ms. Martina Ferrican. And I think Martina really the right person to do this job, because she has been doing this for several years. And 3 years ago, for example, she published a really nice paper comparing the different models of digital trade e-commerce regulation across the world. So I really look forward to her analysis today. Martina, please.
Many thanks, Eri, and nice to see you all. I will share my screen in a moment. Just saying that I'm working in the European University Institute, and I've been working with the ESCAP-ECA and ECLAC regional commissions to develop the methodology and then to verify each of the data sets that are now included in the database. So let me share my screen. What I've done in this presentation is to basically bring together what Watada and Nano just told you, and make a comparison between the countries in the 2 regions. So what I will do is first focus on restrictions and enabling policies, bringing together all the countries in the FEALAC region. Then I will introduce the Digital Trade Integration Index, which is what you already heard about in the regional components presented for ESCAP and ECLAC, and then conclude with a view about regulatory similarity. So how each country compares with the others in terms of each of the 65 indicators contained in the database and index, and then I will conclude with a summary of what I will present. So in terms of restrictions and enabling policies, just to come back to the countries coverage, we have 34 countries covered in the database that are part of FEALAC. Before, Witada mentioned 13 countries, so I believe that China and Myanmar are also part of it. So I'm not sure, maybe they are members but not negotiating. But anyway, I included here all the countries that I saw in the website as members of FEALAC. So the only countries in ESCAP region which is not part of the database is Mongolia for now. And for ECLAC, the only country is Suriname, and Uruguay dataset for now is not included, but we are collecting the data right now. So this will be added in a month or so, that we will also have data for Uruguay. So the presentation of today is based on 34 countries in total. Now, looking at the region, as we just saw in the presentation by Witada, in Asia, we have on average 48 restrictions that are implemented by countries. We see on one end countries that impose high number of restrictions, which are China, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. Here we just look at the number of policies, not at the intensity of the policies. On the other hand, we have countries that are quite open and implement only a limited number of restricting policies, which are New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia. So on average, 48. The average is quite different if we look at Latin America. The average is 49, so considerably much smaller than for Asia. In here, we find that Cuba, Brazil, Argentina are the countries that are most active in implementing restrictions on digital trade. On the other hand, we have Jamaica, Panama, Dominican Republic that are the least active in implementing restrictions. If we put all of this together, what we see is that the FEALAC region has an average of 37 restrictions per country. The most active countries in implementing restrictions are all Asian, as you can see here. So China, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Korea. We only have Cuba, Brazil, and Argentina in the top countries implementing in terms of number of policies. On the other hand, the least active countries, so also the most open in terms of digital trade regulations, are Latin American economies. So that in the top 10, we only have 2 Asian economies, New Zealand and Singapore, in terms of the lower number of restrictions implemented, the fewer restrictions. On the other hand, we also in the database have enabling policies, so policies that support digital trade. If we look at those, we have in Asia on average 16 policies implemented per country that support digital trade. The most active countries are New Zealand, Singapore, Australia. These are also countries that are very active in implementing free trade agreements on digital trade. On the other hand, we have Myanmar, China, Cambodia being the least active in implementing enabling policies for digital trade. In Latin America, the average is a bit lower, so less enabling policies, less activity in implementing policies that support digital trade. The most active countries are Colombia, Mexico, Panama. On the other hand, Cuba, Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, these are countries that implement only a few enabling policies. And here, as enabling policies, you find all the information in the methodology, but we include data protection framework, consumer protection framework, the signing of important international agreements, for example, the UNCITRAL model law on electronic commerce, on electronic signature, the WIPO copyright treaties, etc. If we put together Asia and Latin America, we find an average of 15 enabling policies. And here, the most active countries are again Asian economies. So Asian economies are the most active in implementing restrictive measures, but also the most active in implementing enabling policies. So in general, higher level of activity for the regulation of the digital economy. On the other hand, we see the least active economies are mostly Latin American economies, with the exception of Myanmar, China, Cambodia. Now, if we put together the restrictions and the enabling policies, we come up with an index, the DTI index. The methodology has not been published yet, but is in the pipeline. What the index does is gives weights and scores to each of the policies, or to aggregate the policies. So we don't only look at the number of policies, but also at how they are expected to impact digital trade. If you put all of this together, the most active country in restricting digital trade is China, followed by Cuba, Vietnam, Indonesia. These are countries that are considered to be the least open for integration through digital trade. On the other hand, the best regulatory environment for digital trade in terms of openness is found in New Zealand, so an Asian economies, but then all the other countries are mostly Latin America. So we find New Zealand and Singapore, but then all the others are Latin American economies in terms of openness for digital trade. Of course, this only takes into account the regulatory environment. Then there are a lot of other factors that can impact digital trade. If we look at the pillar level, as it was said before in the presentations, we have 12 pillars that are part of the index. And in Asia, the pillars that are mostly regulated and therefore restricted are the telecom, the pillar covering telecom regulations, intermediate liability, so platform regulations more generally, and FDI, so policies on foreign direct investment. These are the pillars that in which we find the highest number of restrictions in Asia. On the other hand, we find the environment on goods, ICT goods, to be quite open, so low tariffs on ICT goods, low restrictions brought by technical standard, and also quite open regulatory environment for relatively to IP. If we look at Latin America, the pillars that are mostly regulated are the same. So again, we find intermediate liability, telecom, and FDI. So similar pillars in terms of high level of regulation and restrictions. On the other hand, we find that Latin America is a quite open environment on everything that has to do with the access to content online. So there is very few instances of blocking of content, censorship, internet shutdowns, and regulation licensing for ICT services. Also open environment for cross-border data policies, and also low number of quantitative trade restrictions on ICT goods. And this is quite different in Asia because we find instead quite a lot of instances of blocking of content online and restrictions on the location of data. Again, bringing this together, what we find is that on average, the Asian Pacific region is more restricted than Latin America, with the exception of two pillars, tariffs and IP. These are the only two pillars in which we find lower restrictions in Asia than Latin America. And overall, the areas covering goods seem to be more open, trading goods seem to be more open in Asia. To conclude, a couple of slides on regulatory similarity. As I was mentioning before, regulatory similarity looks at bilateral differences or similarities in regulation between countries. So this goes from 0 to 1. 1 means that the country is completely, fully similar to another one. Why? So, and you see here in green, the stronger green means more similar country pairs, while in orange you see the most diverse country pairs. So you see that, for example, China is quite diverse from all other countries in the region. If we highlight the most similar and most different country pairs, what we see is that the most similar country pairs are all in Latin America. So Latin American economies tend to be more similar with each other. While in terms of diversity, we find China and Cuba being the countries that have belong to country pairs that are most diverse from other countries. So we see like China, Guatemala, China, Jamaica, New Zealand, Panama, Paraguay, and Salvador, and then Cuba with Mexico and New Zealand being the most diverse country pairs, which means that these countries have an especially especially high level of difference between each of the indicators that are contained in the index, and therefore efforts to harmonize regulation in these country pairs is particularly complicated to undertake. If we look just at each country, a bilateral similarity, regulatory similarity with all the others in the 34 countries that we analyze. China is the country that is least similar or more heterogeneous. On the other hand, we have a lot of Latin American economies, Peru, Costa Rica, Chile, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, that have high level of similarity with the other countries in the data set. And to conclude, I wanted to show you this graph. We put here the index, so the higher here, the more restrictive the environment, and here the similarity that I just showed. So the higher the similarity, the more similar are the regulations in the pillars. So what we see is, first of all, there is a negative correlation here, which means that where we see a lot of restrictions, we also see a lot of heterogeneity, which is not surprising. And also here, these three pillars, intermediate liability, FDI, and telecom, seem to be the pillars where we see a lot of restrictions and also a lot of heterogeneity. So these are the pillars in which adding some efforts to try to harmonize will be particularly complicated, but also will bring a lot of benefits because countries in these two regions are quite diverse. On the other end, we have some pillars on tariff and trade defense, technical standards, cross-border data flows, IP, and quantitative trade restrictions, in which we find a lot of similarity and also low restrictions. So this could be considered the low-hanging fruit for negotiations, because already we find a lot of countries that have a similar regulatory environment in this. So to conclude, what we have seen is that on one end, in Latin America, we find a more open digital trade environment, but in Asia Pacific, we find more enabling policies for digital trade, so more activity on that front. Across the two regions, the pillars that appear to be mostly regulated with a lot of restrictions are intermediate liability, telecom, and FDI. And on average, in Asia Pacific, we find more restrictions than in Latin America, with exceptions of the pillars covering tariffs and the pillar covering IP. And we find a lot of regulatory heterogeneity across the two regions. Thank you. And I pass the word to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina, for that really nice presentation. Next, let's turn to Mr. Fandi Ahmad for the challenge for LDCs.
All right, thank you, Professor Gao. Maybe I will be the new face in the room, so I would like to introduce myself first. My name is Fandi Ahmad. I'm a doctoral student and researcher at the University of Oxford, and I have been involving in the digital trade project with the ESCAP and also the OECD before. And that's why for today, I want to grab attention a bit about, like when Witada and also Johan talking about Asia Pacific and also Latin America, and Martina talking the comparison between both of them, then I want to take it more into the least developed countries in the data set. So the outline for the presentation today, we have, I would like to start with the importance of digital trade for the LDCs, and also we will be discussing about the areas where LDCs perform well and where the areas to improve, and then we finish with the key takeaways for the presentations. And then for the importance of digital trade, so I just want to remind us that for the LDCs, like there are like economic opportunities outside the countries that they need to grab into, like to gain the economic benefit for the economic growth. And then the digital trade itself will offer, like the diversification of export for markets and products for the LDCs countries. And also because the digital trade will be delivered online through internet, it will lower the cost of delivering goods and services to the other countries. And also the other opportunities that digital trade gives to the other to the LDC's country are the inclusions, because now women in small businesses can reach overseas consumers directly without going through the costly intermediaries. And that's why in this case, it's very important to talk about the, like fostering the regulations for digital trade in least developing countries. Now, when we are talking where the area, the least developed countries are performing well, then actually when we are seeing the ranking of LDCs in Asia Pacific, the LDCs here, we mentioned about Cambodia, PDR, Nepal, and also the recent graduate of LDC Vanuatu into the analysis for today. And LDC ranks in the middle of the RDTII 2 score. It means that actually overall LDCs are not performing very bad. And especially for the Vanuatu is among the lowest RDTII 2 score, means that Vanuatu has good performance in the digital trade. And then seeing the indicators, the pillars of the digital trade, then I tried to put the average score of all countries in Asia Pacific, and then only the average score of RDTII 2 for only LDC's country. And then we can see, if you see like the blue rectangle there, like it's very funny that when Martina said that tariff and trade defense and also IPR are two sectors that, like where the Asia Pacific are performing worse than the Latin America, then we see here that tariff and trade defense for and IPR from the least developing countries are like where the least developed countries performing not really well. And if you see to the pillar 5 and pillar 12, there is also a little gap there. It means that all this is also in sub-pillars under pillar 5 and 12. There are some sub-pillars where all this is provide measures that are quite restrictive. And then now I want to discuss deeper about the restrictive measures that we just discussed. And then, normally, like when we talk about, when we make a presentation, we will talk about international agreements at the end of the presentations. But I intentionally to put international agreements up front, because when I see the data set, it grabs my attention that I see the participations of least developed countries to the international trade agreements are fairly limited. Because if you see that none of the LDCs in Asia Pacific have committed to the open transfer cross-border data flows agreements, or maybe join the UN conventions on electronic communications, or join the WTO agreement on GPA, government procurement. And only few of the LDCs countries adopted model law on e-signature, or even join the WTO AT and its expansions, and also the WIPO, copyright treaty, and performance and phonograms. So it's very important for the least developed countries to join the international standard. So it will allow, like the businesses in the least developed countries to have interoperability with the businesses in the other countries, because by having this kind of standards, then it means that the businesses in the least developed countries can also operate in the other countries easily. And the second areas to improve for the least developed countries is about the high rate of tariff. And then if you see, I put like a yellow star there for the LDCs. And then if you see like a country for like Cambodia, it has like high effective tariff rates, while a country like Nepal, it has like it lacks zero tariff of zero import tariff for digital products. So, and also most of the countries there, they are not joining the WTO ITA or ITA expansion, and that's why they score there in the tariff applied on ICT goods are quite high. And then it's very important for actually for the LDCs to reduce imported tariff on ICT goods, because like when you import ICT goods, then there are two things. First, it can be a source of transfer of technology, because like you are importing ICT goods. But the second one also, like the LDCs can use the ICT goods as an intermediate products for their kind of productions in goods or services. So that's those kind of things that maybe least developed countries can think about when like considering reducing the import tariff on ICT goods. And maybe one way of to do it is by joining the WTO ITA or IT expansions. And then the third area for improvement for LDCs is the intellectual property rights. So if we are going to the data sets of the least developed countries, then we will see that there are practical or legal restrictions regarding the patents. And some of country, like they require for the foreign applicants to have local representative. And then we consider this local representative is costly, because like the foreign companies need to set up, and then it's kind of like a direct cost for them to to operate in the country. And then also the other aspect of patents is about the lack of transparency, because we can find some of provisions saying about that the government can reject a foreign patent on the basis of culture and traditions, moral or social orders. Then there is no clear definitions. What do you mean by culture? What do you mean by fine traditions? And how do you implement these moral or social orders in the future? And it will give some uncertainty for their business in the future. And then that's why if the country put this kind of provisions in the data set, then we will include it as a measure that is restrictive. And the second one about IPR is the foreign works don't enjoy similar protection as local works, because there are some countries who put provisions that they will only protect works for local works for example, in the area of broadcast. They will only protect the broadcast works if the organization have the headquarters in the country, or maybe the transmitter that they use for the broadcasting is located in the country. The other things, the sample for the provision is about, for example, and also they also say that foreign works are not protected unless they were produced by a foreigner living in the country. So those kind of nationality requirement, and also local discrimination between foreign and local are counted here in the data set as restrictive measures. And then the last one I have discussed before about the lack participations to the international agreement. And then the last one that I think this can improve is in the area of telecom infrastructure and regulations. And especially if you see the LDCs, then we will see that the principal telecom company in the country still own 100% or majority by the government. And it comes with no surprise, then we will see that the government will also impose an equity limit for FDI in the telecommunications sector. And that's why we also count this as a restrictive measure in the data set. And the other one is about the complex licensing requirements, because there is some countries in the LDC saying that for increasing or decreasing services prices, then you need to get a permit from the government. And then if you need to get permit for each of change of the price, then it will add another bureaucratic cost for the company in the telecommunications sector, and that will be burden for the digital trade in the as a whole. And then the last one is I think a new measure that we adopt is about lack of passive infrastructure sharing obligations. But actually in our data set we recorded that de facto these passive infrastructure sharing obligations are implemented. And why it's important? Because the passive infrastructure include non non-network equipment. So, for example, the building, the power supply can be shared by network operators. And by doing that, then, like the telecommunications sector can lower the cost of deployment, and it will reach the end of users in the rural areas, and it will increase, like the participation of businesses to the digital trade. And that's why in our data set, we calculate that as like a measure whether if they provide a passive infrastructure sharing, then they they harmonize through like the goal of regional digital trade integrations. So the key takeaways for my side, I say that the LDCs relatively perform well in RDTII2, except in Pillar 1 and Pillar 4 on tariff and also IPRs. And some recommendations for LDCs to consider is, first, they may consider to join the international trade agreements, so they can have interoperability with the other countries. It will increase the participations of, for example, SMEs in their countries to the global supply chains. And the second recommendation is to reduce import tariffs on digital goods. And one way of doing it is by joining the WTO ITA. And the third one is by provide transparent patent process and non-discriminatory protection for foreign works. And the last one is provide measures so that business and consumers have access to affordable and efficient telecommunication services. And just last recommendations, because in our data set, as you see, we have only like 4 least developed countries that we studied. But actually in Asia, Pacific, and also Latin America, we have 13 LDCs. So there are like rooms for improvement for other LDCs if they are interested to see, like, and to know how to better integrate with the other country in the regions in terms of digital trade. And then in this case, ESCAP and ECLAC may work with the development partners in providing technical assistance and capacity building that LDCs need. And that's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fendi. So I want to thank the 4 speakers for really interesting presentations, which highlighted the different aspects of the report. Sure. Yeah, so I understand with that, I want to make some comments. I will turn over to her, please.
Thank you very much. I just would like to make a note based on observations that you found today. In case of Asia Pacific, as we can see, that what the region in general, which is say we are having better position in terms of trade policy, trade barriers, and IP compared to Latin America overall, and also Africa yesterday. But as per Fendi mentions, this is completely opposite when you look into LDCs, because LDCs is become that trade policies and IP is where the rules, the gaps are high. So this is interesting gaps between what LDC in Asia Pacific and the rest of the regions are standing. But I would also make another note that the low scores that LDC have is in many cases is because country in LDC may not yet advance into that regulatory area. So they haven't put regulations. That's why the environment seems simple and low compliance cost. Good or bad is not a thing that we have to judge by the score, because having no regulations at all is not always a good thing. But it is have to have a set of regulations that not too much blocking you from operate with multinational firms with cross-border business. And regulation in LDCs, when the indicators cover and found that they have regulations, in many cases is also just broad framework. Broad framework means probably there is no regulatory solution yet in that area. So for LDC, it would be the recommendations that we have to dig deeper into each particular areas, each indicators, that the existing regulations that they have is already provide effective regulatory solution yet, and that would feed into national roadmaps on how you could be able to enhance the policy effectiveness in digital domain. Thank you.
Thank you, Witada, for highlighting this. I think this is very important for those of you who are health conscious. You probably know that there's an index called the BMI, right? The body mass index. So if you get too high or too low, neither is good, you know. So you want to keep your BMI within a healthy range. So I think the same is true for the RDTII scales. I think maybe in the next edition of the report, maybe it would be useful for you to give a range of so-called healthy scores, you know, depending on the level of development of a country, you know. So maybe if you are middle income country, you have one score, you know, that is recommended range, you know. If you are LDC, you know, you have another score recommended range. I think that would be really helpful, you know, to help countries to try to beef up that regulatory framework. Now, I think we still have a few minutes left, right, for questions, discussion, shall we?
Questions from the floors or from online? Do we have? I cannot, because it's not in the common chat. We don't have questions from online. And any participant in the room would like to make any comment? So probably no questions, maybe. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Dilshad Sharifi, and I'm the head of the International Cooperation Department at the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade of the Republic of Tajikistan. Quite a long name, right? So we have done a lot in the digitalization, especially on the trade procedures, and thanks to ESCAP, with the technical support of the ESCAP, we acceded to the framework agreement on paperless trade. And at the same time, we prepared the readiness assessment report, right? The Tajikistan's readiness to actually implement this paperless trade agreement. And we found out that that there are some obstacles for us to especially cooperate with our, first of all, neighboring countries, and at the same time, the countries of the ESCAP is what kind of obstacles? Basically, it is the infrastructural obstacles, right? The systems that we are using and the systems that the people in the region are using. And I don't think we would have been able to understand these obstacles without preparing this kind of assessment report. And now we understand. And ESCAP, in your database, you already have all these reports, and you can see what bottlenecks we have in order to implement this paperless trade in the region. So now I think we should go further and start working on maybe developing an infrastructure, a single infrastructure, or some sort of an infrastructure that will allow all the countries of the region, especially in the ESCAP region, to have the same type of infrastructure in order to take benefits of this agreement, right? So yeah, that's why I think we should start working on this area as well, and we stand ready, because this is a very the reason why we acceded so willingnessly, right? Because it is a very good agreement, and it will allow us to promote trade, to facilitate the trade procedures. But now this infrastructure limitations, right, is not allowing us to use the benefits of this agreement. So that's, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very useful note, and I do agree. When we say about having infrastructures, I think we have to pay attention both hard infrastructures and soft infrastructures. Regulation is part of the soft infrastructure together with human capital who implement that regulations. So the database that we construct is part of the efforts that we try to provide information to build soft infrastructure. So the next step is we would love to work with each particular countries to utilize this information and build the capacity of those who have to deal with these regulations on the target area. For example, if mentioned by Sandy that IP is the issue, then probably build that first with LDCs on IP issues, and then another country maybe with gap on data rules. So that would be the target for that particular. So target training, target analysis at the country level is our next step.
Sorry, not really a question, but a suggestion perhaps for the ECA team. I think that this zoom into LDC countries at the regional level was very helpful. And I think it could be very useful in the case of Africa as well. Yesterday, we spent some time trying to explain why some countries, particularly Egypt, but also Nigeria and others, are like scoring very high in terms of, I mean, let's say, more restrictive than others. But also, I believe Africa as a continent where we have like a big number of LDC countries, it will be very useful to have this zoom into their scores and compare them to other countries in the northern and southern of Africa. And also, it will be, I think it will also be very useful for them in the negotiation process, because it will allow them to pinpoint areas of where they need assistance and cooperation, and request that in the negotiation, and ensure that it is being provided by other more wealthy or more advanced countries in the sector. So this is just a proposition for the ECA team to consider. And thank you so much for all the presentations.
Thank you, Ritada, and thank you, Yasmin. Just to react very briefly, so we have done it. We had last month we had a consultation in Addis with LDCs, and yes, it's differentiated. And if we take just the issue of tariffs, we observe the same in Africa. LDC would impose more tariffs than the rest of the countries. But as you said, we have a large number of LDCs, 33 out of 54 member states. And in our sample so far, out of the 28, we have 17 LDCs, and clearly they are driving the tariffs score quite up.
No, I also see that we got some questions from online. Does any of the speakers want to address these questions? I think one question is regarding Bangladesh. The other one is regarding digital infrastructure. So any of the speakers here want to address these issues, including Martina?
I can say just a few words on the last comment on digital infrastructure. Although it's more a comment than a question, actually. But just one thing about what you said before, Eri, about the ideal score of the countries. I think this is kind kind of a dangerous exercise because it really changes country by country. And the way in which the index is designed is that the ideal score is actually 0, because a low level of activity doesn't give a score of 0. It gives a score which is higher than 0, because on one end we consider restrictions, and the restrictions add up to the score, but the enabling measures bring down the score. So already the ideal is not having restrictions and having a good enabling framework. Of course, the methodology can always be improved, and we are always improving it. But having no, for example, no data protection law, no consumer protection law makes the score worse. So has a negative impact on the score. So ideally, the idea is to aim for a 0 on overall, but then country by country, there are different priorities that will justify why a country should implement some of those policies that anyway are expected to have a negative impact on digital trade. And we have also conducted an empirical exercise with the countries in Africa for now. ECA is the organization that is in charge of the report. And what we found for Africa is that the index is in a statistically significant way correlated with digital trade, which means that the higher the index, the less digital trade we find in the region. So there is a pattern, but then of course one priority of the country is digital improving trade. Another priority could be supporting certain type of companies, etc. On the comments on digital infrastructure, I just wanted to mention that this exercise, the database and the index, are built in a way that they only focus on regulation and not on infrastructure, skills, and a lot of other things that support digital trade. And it was a choice to decide to focus only on policy to make the index consistent and also actionable in a specific way, which is like improving the regulatory environment in terms of policies. And then, of course, if you have a good regulatory environment for digital trade, but then you don't have a good infrastructure, you don't promote skills, you don't have efforts on education in STEM, support for startups, etc. Of course, then the results will be very different for the countries. And this also explains why in Latin America we have the best regulatory environment between the 3 regions. But then when it comes to digital trade, they are not very active at the global level, because there are a lot of other ingredients that are very important, which are not part of the exercise. Thanks.
Thank you, Martina. Yeah.
I'm going to address the questions on Bangladesh. Bangladesh have not included in our first pilot phase, but definitely we would love to work further with more countries, and any countries, any LDCs that interest to get deeper. Those who are already in the database and want to get deeper for specific areas and further trainings, please feel free. You have my emails, you have the Secretariat emails. So please feel free to contact us. And Bangladesh is an important one that we would love to explore to expand the coverage as well, especially if it is of interest with the national level. Because one thing is, if we have national researchers that work together, it would be even more effective in terms of data collections, data verifications, and feed more effectively to the policy instruments. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all for your presentations, interventions, and joining us in this session. I think we need to conclude our session now. So I want to thank again to everyone, especially ESCAP for hosting this. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for more discussion. Thank you.